What we do here is go back.
My name is Roy Damon, and I wanted to share for you just a moment why I wrote Supplicant. And it's a little bit complicated, but just bear with me for a moment. Back in the year 2008, there was an economic crash that happened whenever the housing bubble collapsed. And with it, people were saying that it was the worst thing to happen since the Great Depression. And it was bad, and people were talking about it everywhere. So, naturally, I became a little bit interested in it. And although at the time I wasn't really politically active, and I didn't like George Bush because of his policies at the time, I wasn't really active. So, what I did was I looked on the internet, first recourse, me being a techie, went right into there we went. And what I did is I went to the very first thing that I could find about prepping. But back then it wasn't really called that, it was called survivalism. That's kind of a term that's changed within the last couple of years to make it sound a little bit nicer. Same thing, prepping. And I stumbled across a forum that was called Zombie Squad, and it was very interesting because at that time what it was a fresh kind of way of looking at survivalism by framing it within the network of a zombie apocalypse, but using that as a jump-off point for any kind of disaster. If you're prepared for zombies, you're prepared for anything. So it was pretty interesting. But it was from their forums that I came across the Survival Podcast and Jack Spirko. And so I would say for about a year or so, that's all I would listen to as a survival podcast, getting ideas. I learned about libertarianism, prepping, survivalism, guns, rights, you name it. I learned anyway. I learned a lot about libertarianism, and it was something that I had heard about here and there. It was kind of cool, third party, woohoo, yeah, more than just two. So I learned a lot about it, and I learned more about what freedom had, what we taught as freedom and what we think is freedom. Two different things. And so I became very invested in this. I was real gung-ho about it. It sounded like something I was interested in. The Constitution, the founding, let's go back to the basic roots. So that's what I did. And of course at that time the person that was running was Ron Paul. And he announced his candidacy for president, and everybody was excited. Every libertarian, I think, just squealed with joy. And I was one of them. I was a part of his campaign. I donated money, and I really believed in him. I think a lot of people did. He was a source of hope for a lot of people because he actually brought something to politics that was lacking, and that was self-respect, decency, and genuine compassion for everyday Americans. Live and let live. And so a lot of people backed him. I backed him. But what happened was there was at every point that you can imagine, the Republican Party and the media blocked this man. You can understand, Ron Paul was followed by thousands, probably millions of people. Every single one of his events was just filled to the brim with people. No matter where you went, every time he went somewhere to speak, there were thousands of people. Meanwhile, you jump to the competition, one or two people showed up, and boring. Because it's the same bull crap that they've been feeding the American public for about how many years. So this was refreshing, and he caught a lot of the younger voters, believe it or not. And I like to consider myself one of those. I'm not so young as I was back then. That was about almost 10 years ago now. But I saw what they did, what the media did. They blocked him every way around, and they pretty much kept him from being nominated. When it was very evident that people wanted him, and they really liked his message. So that, after witnessing that kind of circus and knowing how much support Ron Paul had, I mean, he was a rock star. I mean, where he went, he was a celebrity. I mean, you don't see that with politicians. And if he couldn't break through the crap of government, then nobody else could. And I became very frustrated. And I just threw my hands up in the air. Said, forget it. And I set it to the side for a little bit. I was just forget it. Forget libertarianism, forget everybody. I'm political atheist. Don't want to hear about it no more. But one day, after I had moved to my new house, I was gardening because I still like to do prepping, and I still like to do gardening and things like that. And I think it was about like the 5th time that I tried to keep my greenhouse from blowing away that I was listening to a podcast by one of my friends from the Survival Podcast Forum, Ben Stone, and he had a podcast called badquaker.com. And I started listening to what he had to say. And I discussed with him off and on through messaging, Facebook, things like that. And God knows I probably tested his patience. I started to understand that I was going about the whole thing wrong. And that really, I wasn't a Republican, I wasn't a Democrat, wasn't a Libertarian, that I was a voluntarist. I was somebody that did not believe that government was the solution for everything, and that in fact it was the instigator of a lot of violence and misery in people's lives. So it intrigued me. I wanted to hear more about it, but of course, I'm the kind of person that tests theories. I don't just say, oh, that sounds great, let's just do that. No. What I did is I tested, and I probably tested a lot of people's patience, but I had asked questions because I wanted to understand. And what I really should have done is done a lot more research, and I would have found these things. But you don't know where to look for these things when you first, you just hear what people say, oh, the government's bad, or the police, or whatever. When you start looking for it for yourself, then you start to, come to your own conclusions about things, and eventually I did. So naturally, what I did is probably not the most smartest thing in the world, but I went to Facebook. Just like a new baptized baby, I went onto Facebook and plastered it all over the web. Every little thing I could find, from every little police brutality to every little evidence of corruption in the government to every instance of violence and just hatred and the freedoms that were being taken away. Every single bit of that, I posted everywhere. 12 times a day, probably. As soon as I found like the article, or if I found a picture or something like that, as soon as I found that went straight into the web. and I probably pissed off a lot of people. I won't lie, probably annoyed a lot of people. Most people don't want to hear that kind of thing, and they don't. It gets them upset because they start to worry. And that's something I'm wanting to do as a podcast later, is having to do with what's called normalcy bias. And that's exactly why people get upset whenever you introduce topics to them that they are not ready, because their normalcy, their normal, is being disrupted. And people don't like that normal being disrupted. It makes them upset, makes them angry. They have to reevaluate themselves. Most people don't want to do that. That means thinking, research, education. You know, that was back in school and college. Why am I doing that now? So I had to grow up and realize that I needed to find who my audience was, and that I needed to speak to them instead of trying to create my audience from people that were happen to be in earshot. Because all you do is piss off the other person, you piss yourself off, then you're both angry. And that doesn't help anybody. No one learns anything, and you might get heartburn. So, all the way around, if you want to avoid Tums, just quit arguing with people that don't want to hear it, because they're not going to want to change. No, the people that you want to talk to is those people that understand where you're coming from, and they also, the ones that might already be leaning towards it and saying, you know, there's just something that doesn't seem right, but I want to learn a little bit more. How can you tell me? What can you tell me to help educate me? And then that's where So, of course, my platform of Facebook was the wrong one. So, what would be the right one? And I gave that a long, hard thought. And what I realized is that it was obvious. Ever since I've been younger, which, depending on who's watching this, I probably am still younger, but I consider back then, whenever I was younger in my mindset, back then I just wanted to vomit up all the information. But when I was younger, I wanted to write. Always wanted to write. It's been the one true talent that I've ever had, and it's been the one thing that I've ever wanted to do. So why not use this as a prime opportunity to do what I want? For millennia, people would teach through parables and storytelling. Bards would go through towns and villages, and they would, change the story a little bit depending on who the audience was, but a lot of times the message was the same. Look at Grimm's fairy tales. That is a very good example of the type of stories that taught. Aesop's fables, same thing. So, even look at Jesus, he taught in parables. So, learning through stories is something that we do as humans, and what this gave me an opportunity to do is just that. So, with those skills, I wanted to teach. I could get on here and do podcasting about every single subject I'm talking about, but that won't guarantee that anybody wants to listen. They might. There's certainly more talented people than me on the internet that do this for a living. But I'm primarily a writer. So what I wanted to aim my story towards was to be able to achieve the same self-discovery with the reader through the protagonist. I wanted to use the protagonist as the reader to direct them along the same line of self-discovery that I came through. Does that mean it's going to be successful? No. Am I going to piss off a lot of people? Maybe. But what I'm wanting to do is have this explore humanity, what sentience is, and really show what freedom really is in contrast to what we are told freedom is. A lot of times we are given freedom within the bounds of laws that really aren't moral. They do not really help us. They constrain us. Every law is a constraint. A link in the chain that wraps around our legs and feet. So, with that is the aim of the story in Supplicant, and that's the reason why I started it, so that I could teach what I've learned and hopefully be able to get others to understand, just like I did, the importance of what is happening today, where our world could be going, and where it already is. So, I hope you've enjoyed this. I enjoyed making it. I want to make more of these. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comment section below. You're more than welcome to join me on my website. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and I will be sure to be back with you. But until then, thank you for watching, listening, and reading. Goodbye.